Welcome to Householders, a conversation about American life as Zen practice. I'm Inga Annie Wade.
And I'm Kyosaku John Mitchell, and we're lay members of the Atlanta Soto Zen Center. We are honored to be joined this week on Householders by Mumon Amy Pico, our Dharma sister, who has come to Atlanta from another Sangha, has many chapters in the Zen story that brought her here, and the life story, which is, identical to the Zen story. And there are subjects and expertise that we look forward to talking about, but that's not necessarily what we're here to do. We're just here to commune and convene with our siblings in the Dharma. So, Mumon, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you ended up here in this Sangha and sort of where this is what you and I always talk about, is where you fit, how you find yourself, what you find yourself doing, what's your chop wood, carry water around here.
Mm-hmm. Those are good questions. So I like John, found the Atlanta Soto Zen Center before I lived in Atlanta, and was at a very pivotal point in my life at the time. I had already been separated from my partner for many months and was sort of what I would call in sort of like the cocoon transition phase, which I still feel like I'm in many ways. And knew that I wanted to move, had already sort of set the intention that I wanted to move, but I didn't really know where. And then the pandemic was upon us. And my work as a psychotherapist also went all online. And it was like, the Dharma, or whatever you want to call it, basically was like, maybe you want to look at this possibility. My sister and brother-in-law lived in Atlanta for 3 or 4 years. And so that was sort of the connection to Atlanta. And then I came and did a morning sit. I did the beginner's class and a morning sit before the world shut down. Mm-hmm. And so I was actually in the Zendo and met some of our lovely brothers and sisters and was like, you know what? Let's do this. Mm-hmm. So I found myself here and lived in the Airstream in the back of the Zendo for 4 months as a part of the residential program. And I'm here. I'm a resident now.
Fun fact, Mumon and Kyosaku got initiated the same day.
Yes, we're members of the same class, the class of 2021. What, right? No, it was in November. It's the class of 2020.
Yep, 2020.
Yeah, 2020, the 2020 that was a million months long.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, Lord. Why we say 2020.
That does feel like a really long time ago, and that really wasn't that long ago.
No.
Yeah. And, that kind of just felt like a natural thing since I had already been practicing previously in Illinois. And so there's a lot of other things, of course, I could share about the journey, Zen or otherwise, but, that's how I found myself here. And the chop wood, carry water piece, I found at least, was I'm much better, at least in this setting, right? This particular setting that we have, which is largely a lay practice. Mm-hmm. And it's self-directed. It's incredibly self-directed, as I think many Soto traditions are. Mm-hmm. Some more heavily self-directed than others. And I would say, Sensei is all about, you make your own path. And so mm-hmm. I figured out by trial and error that my path here was kind of making my own monastic path that was actually just my own, that was completely separate from anything else, and in addition to actively contributing towards a project, the Gasho newsletter project, that ASCC had sort of left to the wayside. And that was my way of saying, you know what, this is my way of giving back, not just giving back, but like staying actively involved. That I needed to have a project, I needed to have some type of focus aside from just my regular practice that I'm constantly doing. That there was something that I wanted to engage, right? That I wanted to engage. And that's kind of what I found in way of engagement.
Tell us a paragraph or two about what the Gasho newsletter is and who it's for and what goes into it.
So the Gasho newsletter is a prison newsletter outreach project that ASCC started. It's been at least 20 plus years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a long time ago. When I started digging through the archives, I was like, oh, wow, this went back a long time. Back to a time when they were actually going into the prisons and doing more very hands-on instruction and meeting with inmates. And that, of course, fell to the wayside because life and because, it fell to the wayside long before COVID. And the way that we've transitioned it now is just in way of mailing a newsletter now to about 700 inmates all over the country who have found us somehow. And that still is a mystery to me sometimes. But
that's amazing.
Yeah, it's cool. It's cool. And then we just, I think, give them the elements of the three jewels as best we can, right? We give them, Zazen basics, and we do a Q&A for them where they can ask a question to Sensei or one of the practice leaders. So it's simple, yet I think powerful, especially for people who are isolated.
What do you hope they will get from the Gasho newsletter?
Really just like, I think my biggest thing is a sense of connection, a sense that, because many of the individuals that are asking to be on the newsletter, I'd say it's almost a 50-50 split if I had to guess, on some people that I think are just brand new, don't know anything about Buddhism, and then others who have been practicing for quite some time. And for the ones that have been practicing already, I hope that they feel like they have a connection to a Sangha. And for people who are curious, I hope that they get some really useful information. So to me, that's why it has to stay really simple for those two reasons.
What drew you to the Gasho newsletter? Do you have any connection with incarcerated people?
Not like directly, but oh gosh, you guys are just walking right into it. It's so great. But it's actually one of the ways that I can also segue our conversation into perhaps more related to psychotherapy, which is in the beginning of my career, I was working for an agency down in Illinois, what I would call very typical early psychotherapy work when you are trying to just get good experiences. I was working at a community agency, substance abuse, teenagers, specifically with the juvenile justice system. And it broke my heart. It was about as simple as I can say. It broke my heart. And really seeing, not even so much understanding at the time, because I think I was too young in my career to even understand what I was seeing. But now I know, looking back, what I was seeing was intergenerational trauma. And that so many of the kids that end up in juvenile justice are a result of intergenerational trauma. And feeling incredibly helpless, even though I'm supposed to be helping them. How the heck am I going to create safety for them? How in the heck am I going to even create a sense that they can believe in themselves? They're locked up. And so that, I think, was like my first real touch into that world. And then even just on a personal level, like I take it into more of a I guess, a philosophical way of like, these are the people in our society that have literally been cast out. And if I think for a minute that I am any different, then really I need to start focusing more on my individual practice.
When you were working in that juvenile justice system and kind of getting your sea legs as a therapist, where were you in your Buddhist practice at that time?
It was non-existent at that time.
Never existent? Hadn't found it yet?
I had not found it yet. I was probably, I'm going to guess, I was like 26 and 26, 27. And that will take us into a far longer rabbit hole, but the short version is that I was still extricating myself from a very conservative and rigid branch of Christianity. And that's just a very easy way to say it in like 3 words. And that I was already sort of out, but like psychologically I wasn't out, if that makes sense.
Oh. Yeah, absolutely. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. So Buddhism hadn't come into the picture yet. If I'm going to, quote a portion of one of the contemporary forward faces of Buddhism, Alan Watts, he would say, within the tension is also the underlying unity, right? And so the tension is the fact that my experience growing up in the version of Christianity that I grew up in was incredibly dualistic, right? And that made it real. It made it in some ways easy, because there was a right and there was a wrong and there was a path, and you sort of knew what you were supposed to do and you knew what you weren't supposed to do. But then, like, we all kind of know what happens when we start to like divide ourselves. And of course, I didn't know any of those things because I was indoctrinated in that way. And so to come into Buddhism, now I will just say that from the period of about 25, 26 was when I started to exit Christianity. It took about 3 years. And for about the next 13 years or so, it was over 10. I was like I was agnostic, right? I was the what, I don't know, right? So in that period of time, I wasn't doing any type of real active spiritual exploration. Well, so I just want to put that out there, that like there wasn't anything that I was actively pursuing. I was still curious, but I wasn't really investing or dedicating. And so when I did come to Buddhism, which wasn't that long ago, there were a lot of things that made sense to me.
Yeah.
Right? Because I had already sort of worked out psychologically of the mindset that I had been raised in by then, right? It had been over a decade. And so the tension of understanding that not everyone's experience, and in fact, so many people's experience within Christianity is so incredibly different than my experience.
Yeah.
And that those experiences, many of those experiences actually create a really beautiful unity between Christianity and Buddhism, and that they don't have to be mutually exclusive. And in fact, they have many things in common.
Absolutely. I've talked to quite a few people who have dropped in and said they were Catholic or Christian, and said, it's very peaceful here. I really enjoy it. Which is not something I would have heard growing up, but
right.
It's wonderful that we can share those experiences with each other and not, judge each other for our belief system.
Right. And I found that incredibly refreshing, that Buddhism is so inclusive. It was definitely not, that was the antithesis of my growing up experience. And so being able to be in a place where people, like John, and I know many others who essentially have 2 or possibly even 3 different disciplines that they're practicing. It's really beautiful. It's really beautiful.
Did you feel like that there was any sort of emptiness from the point where you were in between religions, so to speak?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
I'm just curious because it just seems like, well, my family especially has adopted some form of spirituality after they left Christianity, and as have I. So I'm just curious I wonder what that feeling is that needs to be filled.
Yeah, I mean, I could tell you many stories of the essentially the kids that I grew up with, because I grew up in like a legit bubble, like for real. And like the kids that I grew up with, and how many of us like basically like went off, quote unquote, off the rails. I mean,
in Judaism, in like Orthodox Judaism, they say off the derech, which means like off the road, off the path. But like derech, it's supposed to have like connotations of like lying in a gutter.
right. And that essentially, like, I see not just my life, but other of my peers' lives in terms of seeing how they have unfolded, and I'm like, wow, we really could have used a lot more inclusivity, and that there's a lot. I think that's the other tension that I probably will hold for the rest of my life, is kind of almost being now an advocate. So if we tie it together even just with the Gasho newsletter, being an advocate for people who maybe don't feel like they have an option. I know a lot of people who are essentially, staying within their religion of choice because why? Because they're afraid. And so being able to hold a voice, or to even just shine a light on those particular things, I hold very close to me, because it's obviously very personal.
What about your work in mental health and this practice and your religious past? Like where you seem to be triangulating something about the human condition. And I'm interested particularly in those other 2 legs. You've talked about the tension that is a unity in religious upbringing versus a chosen path like Buddhism, which is something that Annie and I love to talk about, and it's definitely the case in different ways for both of us. But we've also talked about our history as patients of psychotherapists, and how that's connected with our pursuits on this path. And so I'm interested from a practitioner's point of view, how those things are connected.
Mm-hmm. So from the mental health standpoint, I look at, and it was the last podcast you guys, I was just telling Andy before you came on, John, that I don't know if it was the last podcast that you actually recorded, but the one that you put out last week, I was like, you guys are walking straight into the conversation we're probably going to have, about the fact that there are, once again, tensions that are both unifying and disorienting around mental health and Buddhism. And from a mental health standpoint, I'm going to see if I can once again say this clearly and succinctly. We are trying to support a person's ego, but not too much.
Yeah.
Right? Because 9 times out of 10, people who are coming to therapy are coming because they don't feel right. They don't feel well. They don't feel mentally well. Yeah. Right? And so our training, and I say our training because there's lots of different ways to be trained as a therapist, but one way to be trained is that you are supporting the person so that they can then go feel better themselves, right? Do whatever it is that they want to do on their own eventually. What does that sound like in Buddhist terms? That sounds like we're supporting the ego, right? And so how then does Buddhism fit, or meditation even? Let's throw out the other 2 jewels. What about just Zazen? Like, what is that? in relationship to mental health. And I think, like Annie talked about in the last episode, or both of you did, it can actually be a risky thing. Zazen can be a risky thing from a mental health standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do we, and Buddhism would say, well, there is no issue, right? They would say that what you are doing by facing yourself can lead to many possible outcomes. And we are not necessarily interested in the outcome per se.
Yeah.
Only that you continue to develop whatever this is that you're doing with yourself. If we're just talking about Zazen, right? And then, of course, everything else. And so I know when I entered into Buddhism, well, number one, I really didn't know what I was doing. And thank God I didn't. Number one.
It takes many years to forget what you're doing if you come in knowing.
This is true. This is true.
A Zen mind, beginner's mind. Not knowing is a great thing.
It really is. Because whether it was because I literally stepped foot in a Zendo the very first time on the first night of a 3-day sesshin, which I would not recommend, by the way. Not a good plan. That
the heroic dose, they would call in my Burning Man world.
That would be a great correlation. Is I started basically after the sesshin, I started to experience some of the ego disintegration that many people experience. Thankfully, I had experienced it in other ways in different contexts, so I wasn't incredibly scared. But the point I'm trying to make here is that if that would have been a client of mine, if that would have been someone else, right, that like was under my care, and they came back and they told me what they were experiencing and they were anxious, P.S. They didn't know, right? It created some anxiety around them. Like, from a mental health standpoint, that may have not been the best choice for them, right?
Yeah.
And so, I think in the previous conversation, you guys had talked about MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, and how there's these other essentially offshoots of Buddhism, really, that, let's put it this way, put nice little fluffy clouds around Zazen, and that's a good thing. I think that's a good thing, right? Because it can be a doorway into a deeper practice if that's something someone wants to pursue.
Right. So like build someone up before they start this ego tearing down.
Well, at least you get an idea of what sitting with yourself is like.
Yeah.
With some guidance, right? Because usually MBSR, there's some type of guidance. I don't know about you guys. Aside from going to a beginner's class, I didn't get any guidance. And that's the Zen way. Being at Green Gulch, spent a month at Green Gulch. Aside from the onboarding that they get you so that you don't get lost. Oh, but they don't actually direct you to where you're supposed to go. Like, I literally walked onto the campus of Green Gulch and there's no welcome wagon. You literally have to find your own space because that's all part of the experience, right? And so I'm not going to recommend to a person with, say, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, hey, maybe you should go sit Zazen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm probably not going to say that.
Well, I think I had a different experience than that. I feel like I started with the book club, and obviously this isn't like a therapist guided session or anything, but we got to talk about a lot of things after, we meditated for 30 minutes. So we'd sit there and talk about the book, but also you kind of get to talk about what you're feeling like too. And that was kind of a nice balance of that. And, book club isn't exactly like a traditional Buddhist experience. So that's kind of more of probably a Western idea put in there anyway. So maybe there is more liminal or in between Buddhist experiences that might not be as like extreme.
Well, I agree that it's kind of a Western construct for as a thing for a sangha to do, but I do think that is really just an effect of the fact that that's what Western people like to do when they hang out in affinity groups with each other. That really it's just a natural expression of what we would do as a sangha because we're all like intellectual Westerners. And
no judging. That's what got me into it, really, was the community. So again, we're back full circle what I always talk about.
Really, that's what I was going to say is like, I actually think that's the perfect example for you because your refrain is so often the Sangha part is the part that holds everything together. And I was going to put that in kind of the form of a question to Amy, like though certainly recommending the one jewel of Zazen to every single person is fraught with risk. And you know, we've talked about this before too, even with a more well-rounded container, like Zazen is just inherently risky for some people, no matter what else you're doing, or who's, you know, guiding you or whatever. But for those for whom Zazen is a healthy exploration of disintegration, do you feel like Sangha, like for us, do you feel like Sangha has a role similar to the role of the supportive person, the therapist, as which you described as a role of supporting?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, I think for any type of another term that you guys maybe have used or stumbled upon that I like to use is also spiritual emergence. That if you are, whether it's a result of your spiritual practice, whether it's a result of other things that have happened, very often these get triggered by someone dying or, you know, some sort of trauma. Point I'm trying to bring about in this is that when we have, yes, some type of community, some type of support, when we are in sort of this internal type of chaos or this internal type of disintegration, I mean, well, number one, that's what's going to get us through it. You know, I mean, because the people who I think did the research, I don't remember who you said, or if you said, John, last week, who the researchers were, but I mean, that's what they were trying to kind of tell people about, right? Is these are the things that could happen. The part that I'm imagining they didn't say is, well, what happens if you start to experience that, but you have people that you can talk to about it? And on top of that, they have a frame of reference for what you're going through.
Yeah.
Maybe that would be beneficial to allow yourself to go through it. I think that's what I see very often, and it's a fine line, I will say, is that there are clients, once again, they're not sitting zazen, they're doing other things in their life, but they're sort of operating on this edge that we talk about a lot in Buddhism. And the edge is very scary, as it probably should be. But how can we allow ourselves to be less scared? Right? And do, as we talk about in our practice, you know, open up to that feeling. And I think having the support, however that looks, is going to allow us to open up to it more and become less scared.
Householders is a production of the Atlanta Soto Zen Center in Atlanta, Georgia, and the Silent Thunder Order. Find us on the web ataszc.org.
Our Sangha depends on your support. You can donate by PayPal to donate at storder.org. Gasho.